Today on Don's Cobra Show, I visit the Shelby American Collection in Boulder, Colorado.
Yeah, this is CSX 2000. So this is the very first Cobra, and you know, of course, these came from the AC Bristol. And Carroll dropped in the 260 V8 and sent this out to the different magazines. It was painted different colors, and it was revolutionary. You got to think in terms of its competition in that time frame, because you had 356 Porsches, and this thing was a rocket ship. It was just amazing. It was so light and nimble and super high performance for its day in 1962, 1963. We've also got the very first race car in the back, the CSX 2002. So on CSX 2002, it's known as the Billy Krause Riverside car. And it wasn't a super successful racer, but it was driven by Ken Miles and Dave McDonald and Dan Gurney and Billy, I think Billy Krause, I mentioned that. But the cool thing was, is that it let them get out, and it showed the potential of the Cobra. And you can see that, it's got the early hardware on it. It doesn't have side vents. It's got the kidney bean wheels. And then to run in the FIA, it had to have these spats, which would cover the tires. That was a FIA regulation. The car had a lot of, it didn't, broke a lot, didn't DNFs, and it let them develop the Cobra more. And the next series were the Sebring cars, and the Sebring cars performed a lot better. They made, you can see that picture in the back when they won Sebring. That was one of their early victories. And then after the Sebring series were the Cobra Le Mans. And we have two of the factory team Cobra Le Mans roadsters here. They were designed to run at Le Mans. They got short trunks, and they could accommodate the hard top, which was a little more aerodynamic for the larger tracks. This one, this is CSX 2137, It's a very significant car because this is the first Cobra that won an FIA race with Dan Gurney and Bob Bondurant driving. This is known as the Cobra that struck first blood in the Cobra Ferrari wars. And this is the first time an American car with an American driver won an FIA race, the Federale International Association. So, very important car. The next series of cars that Carroll built were for the USRRC, United States Road Racing. And we've got a number of examples of those here. And they could run with the short windshields. They were the cutback door. If you look on the side here, you can see that the door is cut back to accommodate the larger Halobrand wheels and the larger tires. So they ran in the USRRC, United States Road Racing Series, and in 1964, Carroll won. And we have the championship car here that Ken Miles drove, which is CSX 2431. So Carroll won in the USRRC championship. Of course, later on, he won the World Manufacturers Championship in FIA with the FIA Cobra Roadsters and the Daytona Coupes. And we'll talk about that in a second. But this is a very significant car that primarily was driven by Ken Miles. This is CSX 2431. Again, you'll note that this is the most advanced iteration of the Cobras, except for the FIA Cobra, with the large flares up front and in the rear, the cutback door to accommodate the larger Halobrand wheels. So next up were the FIA Cobras to race in Europe. And they built 5 FIA Roadsters. Only 2 survive fully intact today. The car that we have is CSX 2345. And it is probably the most significant Cobra of them all, because this car ran in Europe with the Coupes in 64 and 65, won the World Manufacturers Championship in 65 with the Coupes. Our car is driven by Phil Hill and Bob Bondurant, Sir John Whitmore, Roy Salvadori, Jack Sears. Everybody ran in it, and it has 5 first place FIA wins. And the really cool thing about it is completely unrestored, even down to the tires. Those are the tires that Bob Bondurant won Rossfeld hill climb in June of 1965. It also went to Pebble Beach, and I don't know if you noticed, but at Pebble Beach, it was not only invited, but it won first in class and then won overall for post-war preservation. So in the FIA series, you had to run with a full windshield. You had to have a speedometer. And what's one of the most distinctive features are the FIA nubs. And basically those came from when the cars, when they went over in 64 and the cars went through tech, the FIA suitcase had to fit in the trunk along with a spare. And it wouldn't fit. They couldn't close the trunk, so they had to make a quick modification so they could close the trunk. And you'll notice that the cars that ran in Europe usually had bungee cords around the trunk. And that was because some of the tracks, like the Targa Florio or the Nürburgring, were pretty rough in those days. And the trunk would tend to come loose, so that would hold it down. And also, when this car went to Europe in 64, it was painted Viking blue. You can see that underneath the hood. And then when Ford got involved with Shelby in 65, they wanted all the cars Ford blue, which was the Guardsman blue. So the car was resprayed in Europe, but they didn't do a really great job. I mean, you know, inside the doors and trunk, and so it still retains the Viking blue. An interesting historical note is you'll notice under the hood, written in chalk, which is still there, is the firing order of the American V8, because the Europeans just didn't, you know, they weren't that familiar with the V8. So when they were tuning it up and doing maintenance on it, they could look up and see the firing order written underneath the hood.
That's awesome.
So I think we've probably got the largest collection of GT40s here at the Shelby American Collection. So we'll start here. This display that we have set up here is after Daytona 1965, and this is actually how the car is placed. First, second, and third. So the two GT40s were running in the prototype class. So they got first and second in prototype, and then the Daytona Coupe was running in the GT class. So it won first in GT class, second overall. So they flew these two cars to LAX, and there's lots of historical pictures of them coming out of the plane. They were the white with the dark blue, like that paint scheme up of that nose that's hanging up there. And they were clapped out race. They were really beat to hell. And Carroll basically had, this is the end of '64, Carroll had 6 weeks basically to completely revamp them and to take them to Daytona. So obviously, you know, he was running the Guardsman Blue on everything, so the cars got resprayed Guardsman Blue, but they got lightened. They got Halibran magnesium wheels, although you'll note on this car that the front wheels are magnesium, but the rear wheels are aluminum, because Halibran wasn't able to produce anything in time for Daytona. So the rears were aluminum. They actually ran this race with the Claudi gearbox, but you know, they had Cobra 289 race engines that were proven. They didn't have enough time to get the ZF gearbox in, but they had lightened the car. They had made changes up until the last minute. You can see, you know, little additions, aerodynamic tweaks that they did, and they won the race. But the real goal was to go to Le Mans. So they won Daytona in '65, the first race of the season, first win for the Ford GT40. But the real goal was to go to Le Mans. And they went to Le Mans in '65 with a series of Mark Is. Ford provided the engines, but they all broke. And you know, there was a metallurgy issue with the head bolts, and they blew head gaskets. So you know, it was disaster in '65. For the '66 season, Ford had come out with the new 427, and they had instructed Shelby to modify the Mark I so it could accommodate the 427 side oiler, you know, their new and wonderful engine. So Shelby built the Mark IIs. And what Ford did for the Le Mans series is, you know, they gave about half the cars to Shelby American, and they gave the other half to Holman and Moody. And our two examples here, we have 1015, P1015, and P1016. So the light blue car was a Shelby car. The Sunburst Gold car, 1016, was a Holman and Moody car. And as you know, Henry had this idea that you know, as the race progressed and they were clearly going to win, he wanted everybody to slow down and go across the line together. You know, it's rumored that the idea was that all 3 cars would win first place, or there was some crazy idea about that. Ken Miles was driving 1015. He was the primary driver on 1015, and Shelby American had him a full lap up. As it turns out, the French missed that lap. So when the guys came across the line, they all slowed down. The 1046, which Bruce McLaren was driving, the black number 2 car, he sped up a little bit. Ken didn't think anything of it because Ken believed he was a full lap ahead and that he had slowed down for this photo finish. But the French lost that lap, depending on whose view you believe. So Bruce McLaren in 1046, P1046, was given the first place designation. But most of us that have studied the history believe that Ken Miles actually won. The other aspect was that the race rule says it's the car that covers the most distance in 24 hours. Well, Ken Miles outqualified Bruce McLaren and was gridded much further up. So McLaren was further back in black P1046, but covered more distance as a result. Anyway, in any case, the Mark IIs were highly successful. They won Daytona, they won Sebring, they won Le Mans. So after this photo finish, Henry Ford was beside himself. He was just so pleased with the result. But a lot of the European press, made the comment that, yeah, you won, but that's actually a English car. It was derived, from the Lola GT. It was built in Slough, in England. So Henry decided that they were going to be back in 1967 with a brand new car, the GT40 Mark IV, that really wouldn't have any parts that were interchangeable with the Ford GT. It wouldn't even be called a GT40. It would be called a Ford GT. And it was the Mark IV, and it was the aluminum tub. It was an amazing car. Initially, it was called the J car, after the Appendix J of the Le Mans rules. And unfortunately, Ken Miles was killed at Riverside testing J2. And it's believed that it was the first use of aluminum honeycomb for a tub, for the structural tub, and it's believed that the suspension might have separated from the aluminum honeycomb tub. So Ken was killed at Riverside, actually in '66, testing the early J car. They went back and they reinforced the tubs, and they did destructive testing on J1, and then they built 6 Mark IVs, and they became the full Mark IVs. The 6 Mark IVs, one never raced, the other 5, one raced at Sebring, which we have, that's J4, and with Mario Andretti and Bruce McLaren, won Sebring. That car's out on loan, so it's not here right now. And then the other Mark IV that we have is J7, and Mario Andretti drove that at Le Mans. They took 4 Mark IVs to Le Mans in '67. You can see the starting grid. And there's some leftover Mark IIs from '66 in there, but you can see the red number 1, yellow number 2, and then our car, it's called Ember Glow, number 3 car, and then the number 4 car, the dark blue. Those were the 4 Mark IVs, and they wound up winning this race. Of course, our car that Mario Andretti was driving, J7. He was clocked at like 232 miles an hour down the Mulsanne and set a track record at Le Mans that has never been beat by a non-turbocharged car. So really important. And after the win, the French basically said, don't bring these cars back. We're changing the rules. They're not going to be legal, in '68. So after they won in '67 and announced that the cars wouldn't be legal going forward, Henry Ford said, "Hey, I think I've shown the bastards. We're pulling out of racing." So the story, just to wrap up the GT40 story, you remember John Wyer, who was somewhat humiliated that he lost the GT40 program and that Shelby went on to win in '66 and '67. He went to the Gulf Oil Company, said, "If you'll finance me, I'll go back to the Mark I configuration, the steel monocoque with the small block, dressed up a little bit with Gurney Westlake heads, but basically a small block V8. And they went on under his direction to win Le Mans in '68 and '69 with the Gulf team cars. In fact, our car here is 1074. It has won a lot of races, but it didn't finish at Le Mans. It won Spa and Reims and so on. It turns out that 1075 actually won both years. In part, why we have the Shelby American Collection it is to highlight and to teach the public of the impact that Carroll Shelby had on American racing. Because as you know, with the GT40 program, it was really born out of the fact that Henry Ford II, the Deuce, tried to buy Ferrari. The deal was collapsed at the last in the 12th hour, and the Deuce, Henry Ford II, was so upset he wanted to find a prototype, a sports racer that could humiliate Enzo Ferrari at the most prestigious race in the world, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. So he had the Ford guys teamed up with Lola with their new car, the Lola GT, and from the Lola GT came the Mark I GT40. And initially they gave the program to John Wyer. John Wyer was a British guy, a team manager, and he was the go-to guy when you had a racing team that you wanted to launch. For instance, he was running the team for Aston Martin in 1959 when Carroll Shelby, as a driver, won Le Mans. So he knew what he was doing. But when they gave him the GT40 program, he ran the cars, and they gave it to him in '64. He ran the cars with Barani wire wheels and Colati gearboxes. They were heavy. They never finished a race in '64. And at the end of the '64 season, the last race of the season was in the Bahamas. The Ford guys were humiliated. Both these cars were running, 103 and 104. Both of them failed to finish. And so Ford pulled the program from John Wyer and gave it to our hero, Carroll Shelby, because he was winning everything. He was winning in SCCA, he was winning in USRRC with the Cobras, and he was doing quite well in Europe.